We're very happy to have for one of our spring lectures. We're having another lecture in April. Matt Sienkiewicz from Boston College, and you see it right there. He's speaking about Jews, American popular culture, and the politics of identity. Glad to see many of my students, of course, in world religions, so it's very relevant. Without any further ado, what do you want to turn the lights off?
No, we don't need to. I think. Okay. I mean, it should be okay. If you
for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Oh. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much to Mark and to the Weinberg Institute. It's very nice to have this opportunity to come and speak to you. And it's also a great opportunity for me to return to one of my favorite subjects. I'd been away from this for a while. Mark, Dr. Rabbi Shapiro, I don't know what the proper nomenclature is, asked me to come and talk about Jewish studies. Jews on television has always been an interest of mine. I haven't written about it for a while, but this is a great opportunity to dig back into it and see what was going on and also look at some of the literature that's been written about it. And what I'd like to do is start with what might seem a strange beginning, but nonetheless, I want to talk about Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane's show. This is actually pretty good timing after MacFarlane just hosted the Oscars to considerable criticism. Who's familiar with Family Guy? A pretty good array. It's a primetime animated sitcom on Fox. It's known for a lot of things, but one of the things it's most known for is for offending with its humor. For being very aggressive in its portrayals of race, religion, sexuality. It has this terrible sort of approach towards male-female relationships. There's a lot of rape jokes. It's very offensive. It's meant to be ironic, and that's really up to you to decide if you believe it is, but certainly it draws the attention of many. It draws the ire of some and the attention of many. And I was reading a New Yorker article about Seth MacFarlane, and he was sort of accused by the author. He said, well, why are you so offensive? Why do you think you can get away with this? Seth MacFarlane's this sort of very waspy, kind of hegemonic-looking white man, right? How can you get away with this? And he said this. He said, well, some people say that stereotypes exist for a reason. I'm in no way qualified to make that determination. I'm sitting in a room writing with a writing staff that is in large part Jewish, and those are the guys pitching the jokes. And first you read, they're like, oh, okay. And then I thought, what? What? So you've got a room full of Jews, and that means you can make these jokes about Asians and gays and lesbians and the handicapped. What on earth is going on, right? It's very strange, right? And so I was interested in this moment of my reading where it's like, on the one hand, it kind of made sense for a minute, and on the other hand, it makes no sense at all. You know, it sort of goes back to that kind of idea, you know, you can make fun of your own in a way, right? There's a very famous and excellent Seinfeld episode where the dentist, Tim Waitley, converts to Judaism so he can make jokes about Judaism. But that's not what's going on here, right? The Jews, yeah, they're making some jokes that are about Jews, but they're making jokes about everybody. And so the question that I wanted to ask, and the one that I want to explore today, is why does that even have that moment where it sort of makes sense? What is this construction of the Jew that kind of excuses this way of looking at all sorts of minorities? How is the Jew kind of standing in for all these minorities, saying, no, it's okay to make these jokes, the writers are Jewish? Right, and so what I want to do is kind of look through three what I'm going to call discursive trends. Trends in the portrayal of American Jews that I think are new or different, that have changed over time. And I'm not saying that these are the kind of things that MacFarlane sits down and thinks about, but that this is sort of what the construction of the idea of the Jew is in elements of contemporary American society, which I think in some ways kind of lets us get into that idea that, yeah, Jews are this minority group, they're different, and somehow they can sort of get away with this in a way that other people can't. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is the kind of thing they sit around in the Family Guy writing room and talk about these abstruse trends that I'm going to talk about, but I want you to think through these ideas with me. What is this construction of the Jew in American society? And I want to point at three different sort of trends that I'm going to look at and make an argument that this has something to do with the question that I prompted. One, this idea of the Jew as marquis, the lord of the borderlands. A Jew as a cultural translator, a Jew as a kind of in-between. Then a Jew as a racial insider-outsider. This has to do with blackness. This question of the Jew and the Jew's relationship to African Americans, relationship to sort of a racial otherness. And lastly, the Jew is specifically universal. And this is sort of the most sort of abstract one. But the idea that somehow Jews speak for the universal. And we'll go through these with examples. The ideas are sort of abstract, but hopefully by bringing them down to earth with some examples, you'll get something out of it. So the first thing I want to talk about this idea is as the Jew as marquee. So a lot of, especially European Jewish names, have sort of very obvious origins. You know, Neil Diamond's family probably sold diamonds at some point, right? You know, names often had to do with somebody's job. But there's one sort of trend in European Jewish names which has often confused people, and that's the ones that sound like Marx, Marcusa, Marcus. And it's a question of whether or not this is a true etymology or just sort of one that fits the story, but that this idea that the marquis, which is where Marx and Marcus and Marcusa come from, has something specifically Jewish to it. So what's a marquis? A marquis is a noble person. It's a noble person in European medieval society, and it was the person who ruled the borderlands. It's the person who got like the space that nobody wanted and kind of allowed people to cross through it. Kind of gave safe passage, made the connection points between one group and another. And in fact, it's true that the first ever Jewish nobleman on record is a guy by the name of Joseph Stefano, who was in fact a marquis. But one way or another, this name marquis has somehow gotten taken up into Jewish ethnicity, the Jewish world. There's this idea of the marquis being somehow related to the Jew. I give you here a picture of a marquis and one of my favorite baseball players, Jason Marquis, who is in fact an American Jew. And so I want to talk about this idea to start, that this construction of the Jew as a cultural translator, as a go-between, an in-between. And I want to say that this is something that actually is deeply rooted in the origins of American popular culture, and particularly the cinema. The cinema is not historically what you think of it as, necessarily. It's actually much more of a cultural borderland than you might think. We think of cinema as being very glamorous. We think of the Oscars. We think of the Cannes Film Festival. But that's not what cinema originally was. Originally, it was something that was rooted in urban America, mostly New York and New Jersey, not so far from here. And it was not for the wealthy. It was not for people to watch and sit around and talk about the deep meanings. It was for new Americans, essentially. It was for immigrants. It was a form of entertainment that allowed new people to come into the country and start to sort of assimilate, right? It was silent for the most part in the early days, so language was less of a problem. And it had this sort of a welcoming element to it, right? This is a way into American culture. And Jews and Judaism were actually built into it from the start. It's been true for a long time. It's certainly true from the early days that many producers in the film business were Jewish. This largely comes from the fact that it was a new business. So you had new immigrants in the early 20th century who couldn't get into Wall Street, couldn't get into, oh, you name it, whatever business there was. And the film business was new. New entrepreneurs came, and a lot of those people happened to be Jewish. It's not just the owners, though. There's also a sense in which portrayals of Jews were built into the very early stages of cinema. Early short films were based largely on comic strips. They often used ethnic stereotypes and caricatures. They also drew upon vaudeville, the Yiddish theater in particular. And the sort of idea of this Jew as this character that anybody can go and watch and sort of understand his story as your story played into a lot of early cinema. It was a really important part. Right? The idea is you watch the Jew and you sort of apply those ideas to your own ethnicity. And this came out very famously in a film known as The Jazz Singer. Who's seen The Jazz Singer? Who's familiar with The Jazz Singer? What's The Jazz Singer's claim to fame? Was that? The first talker, the first sync sound picture, right? It was a very big hit. And a lot of that was because it was the first sound picture. But I want to make an argument that also there had something to do with its portrayal of Judaism that played part of this story. It's a story about a guy, Jackie Rabinowitz, who is second generation. His parents are Orthodox, very observant Jews, and he wants to sort of assimilate into America. So I want to show you a clip of the way in which this film really points to specific Jewish practice. So we have Jackie's father dying here. And the song you're hearing is Kol Nidre, the song that is sung on the eve of Yom Kippur every year. Here we have Al Jolson playing Jackie as the cantor. He's singing the prayer. It's a sort of a remarkable thing, right, that the first ever sound picture would feature extended, fairly authentic sort of Hebrew prayer, right? And part of what I want to say here is that what made the film a hit was not just that it had sound, which, you know, if you were hearing Sing Sound for the first time, this would be amazing, but there's something about this character of the Jew that really hit, that really made sense not just to Jewish filmgoers, but the people who are looking at this. You know, this is a story about somebody from an outside culture trying to make it. And there's a way in which the Jew is sort of supposed to be the identification character, right? That idea of a cultural borderland, the in-between for, you know, the old country and the new country, right? And this movie was an enormous hit, partially because of the technology, but also because of the way it resonated. This was built into early American cinema. This happened for a while, and then it changed rather quickly. It became a point of a problematic point, where after a while, the cinema moved out of strictly sort of being interested in urban spaces. The immigrant audience was not the audience that it wanted most. And there was fears amongst many of the Jewish producers that if the films were too Jewish, it would draw attention to Jewish power. That in fact, you know, while yes, certain people will identify with a Jew even if they're not Jewish because they sort of understand coming from a new space into from an old one, how's it going to play in Peoria kind of thinking, right? And this sort of thing you don't see much. You don't really see it much in cinema since then until you get to sort of niche films geared towards Jewish audiences or sort of for specialty viewership. You do, however, find a sort of interest in bringing together ideas of Jewish characters, like sort of in a way that scholars have talked about being sort of almost crypto-Jewish. Right? So the idea of there being Jewish characters doesn't go away, but we don't see things like this. We don't see characters singing Hebrew songs. We don't see them doing things that are sort of too specifically Jewish. And this rolls over into the television business also. People like William Paley and David Sarnoff, who are running the early networks, are very Jewish, very concerned about seeming too Jewish, about Jewish power being too obvious in the media. And a lot of scholars have looked at this and made a claim that you get a change in American popular culture from the early days until the early days of the cinema to even up until the 1990s, where you get less Jews and more kind of Jewishness. Right, and one of my favorite examples here is this is George Costanza's parents in Seinfeld. And so George is played by Jason Alexander, who is a Jewish actor. His parents are played by Estelle Harris and Jerry Stiller, who are sort of very famously Jewish actors. They seem to act out a lot of sort of Jewish stereotypes, things from Philip Roth novels and stuff like that. But yet they're the Costanzas. They're an Italian family. The producer of Peter Meloff of Seinfeld made a joke once that perhaps they're in the witness protection program. Right? But you get this idea that yeah, okay, Jews are still going to be there, Jewish jokes are still going to be there, Jewish ideas are still going to be there, but we're not going to throw it out there. Seinfeld occasionally it's got an episode with a mohel, a ritual circumciser, but this is true largely across popular culture. It becomes few and far between where you see a Jewish character who's sort of very overt in his Judaism. Yeah, Jerry Seinfeld's Jewish, the characters and friends seem to be Jewish, but how do you know that? Maybe there's a menorah way in the background, right? It sort of seeks to the background. An argument that I want to make is that particularly in the past 10 years or so, particularly since September 11th, we've seen certain returns of that kind of overt Judaism that can play that role of the marquee, particularly with regards to using Jews as stand-ins to help explain other cultures, and particularly Islam. This isn't one of my favorite examples. It's from a short-lived but a very good series called Verionica Mars. Anybody familiar with Verionica Mars? It's good. I recommend it if you have Netflix. This is an episode that aired in 2006, and the background is not so important. Essentially what's going on is there's a prisoner experiment taking place. They're seeing how the guards treat the prisoners in sort of an academically set up situation. And you'll see how here Judaism all of a sudden is very much in the foreground.
Eggs knuckles.
Yeah. Can't eat that, it's pork. And your mother was a pig? Like kosher.
Yeah, I don't get that.
I mean, why won't your kind eat pork? It's not like it's expensive. Where did you get those? I'm not asking you again. I'm not telling you. Well, then you're only solitary. You can sit in there all curled up in the dark and pretend you're hiding from the Germans.
Now, in and of itself, this is just sort of one example. It seems to be, well, it depends on how you're going to view it, right? But I want to make an argument that in this case, this airing in 2006, it's not just using the Jew to talk about the Jew, it's using the Jew to talk about something else. And I'm going to make the claim that to watch that in 2006, it's hard to avoid thinking about things like Abu Ghraib. It's hard to avoid thinking about the many Muslims that were imprisoned by American troops across the world, Guantanamo Bay, and so on and so forth. That the Jew here is being made specific, right? We're talking about kosher, which is a very specific part of Judaism, right? And it's in order, I'm arguing, to at least on one level, evoke the idea for American viewers that there are certain people who are different, right? Who have certain needs and certain demands regarding their religion, regarding their cultural space. And is this something necessarily that every viewer is going to get from it? Absolutely not. But if you look at the iconography of the episode, and you look at what we have sort of in these very famous pictures, I think seeing the Jew as a stand-in here for the Muslim is a reasonable interpretation. And it's something that we see in other places also. Recently, NCIS did an episode called The Shiva. It's a word for Jewish mourning period. And this becomes sort of a stand-in for questions about drone warfare. Right? The Jew sort of becomes a symbolic element of it. And it's something that we see all over the place. I want to give you a few clips from The Daily Show, one in this context.
With all the strife and fighting overseas, it's easy to lose sight of the turmoil at home. There are hot spots here that are disintegrating in chaos. The world sits idly by. Wise neck out of Long Island.
We've all heard about the religious structure that's been enraging Manhattanites. Now a similar controversy is engulfing Long Island.
Call it a whole new war in the Hamptons. Residents of the village of West Hampton Beach says the proposal of an A-roof is an outrage.
That's right. A Jewish Orthodox group has been given permission to erect a religious boundary called an A-roof around West Hampton Beach. A structure supporters claim will be harmless.
It's just a religious freedom issue. And if your religion requires that error, you should be able to do it.
But for others, it's an aesthetic issue.
It would totally transform the look of this town, which I enjoy.
What does an Arab look like, Charles?
Basically, you wouldn't even see the thing. It's a matter of...
Let's see it.
No, because it's a line. It could be a thin line running through the poles in the street around the whole area. It really is almost invisible.
Yes, the beautiful seaside power lines will be ruined by this. Wait, this. Over here. See? What is the problem with letting them have a string around town?
It will attract many, many Orthodox Jews who want to break the rules of their religion.
Oh, so maybe the view he's talking about is less this and more this.
So this one did the work for you a little bit at the beginning itself, right? It compared issues of what was known as the 9/11 mosque and the idea of sort of the place of Muslims in America, and then it goes straight into this discussion of this rather abstract element of Judaism. Like a really sort of specific oddball kind of thing that if you're outside of sort of religious circles, you're not likely to see. Right? And part of what I want to say here is that they're zooming in on this, partly because it's a funny story, but also because it sort of resonates beyond the idea of a Jew. Right? It's the Jew sort of standing in here for somebody who has outside needs, right? Somebody who is not in the mainstream of American culture, but you can, sort of play that in-between role, right? You understand that Jews are part of American life, but look, there's these things about them that are sort of strange and specific. And this is what I mean by this role of playing the marquee, this kind of in-between space that you really would not have seen in American popular culture maybe 20, 30 years ago. Part of this has to do with changes in the America media world, the way in which we have so many more stations, there's so many more outlets. But there also seems to be a sort of comfortableness with zooming in on certain elements of Jewish life for the purpose of getting at bigger issues. Next topic I want to discuss is the idea of a Jew as a racial insider/outsider. And this very much has to do with Jewish relationships to African Americans. This is a quote from psychologist and cultural theorist Sander Gilman talking about 19th century ideas of Jews. The general consensus in the ethnological literature of the late 19th century was that the Jews had black skin or were at least swarthy. I always wanted to be swarthy, but I think it's being used negatively here. The idea here, right, is that there's some connection between Jews and racial otherness, right? And this has been sort of a touchy subject in American history. Relationships between Jews and African Americans has always been very difficult, been very complicated. And what I want to sort of go through here is the idea that we had a period of time where this was kind of embraced and sort of thought through very carefully. Then it kind of went away, and now we see it coming back in a variety of contexts. So again, to talk about the way in which it was sort of grouped together, we can go back to the jazz singer. So the jazz singer is the story of a Jew who is trying to sort of break away from Jewish culture in order to assimilate into American culture. We saw at the beginning sort of his it's actually from the end of the film, at the beginning of the presentation, his embrace of specifically Jewish culture. But how does he break into American culture? One of the ways he does it is he performs in blackface. So very quickly, something that is going to offend the contemporary eye, but it's part of American cinema history. So we look at this from a contemporary eye and it offends, right? It's something that we sort of see the problems with. But it's important to go back and look again. This is the first sound picture. And the songs that were big hits was a Jew dressed in blackface singing minstrel songs. And, you know, this is not a coincidence. On the one hand, there is a sort of sense of connection between the Jew and the African American that's built into Western cultural understandings. The African American being the sort of most put upon minority in American culture, the Jew playing that role symbolically in European culture. And the idea of there being some sort of symbiosis is there, and I think that's part of why you know, this is chosen for this first big project, right? But there's something else to it that's a little more problematic, a little more worrisome, right? Which is that, of course, in donning this blackface, Jolson, the Jewish character, right, is differentiating himself from the African American. Because he has to put on the blackface to become black, right? And in some ways, he's pronouncing his whiteness in doing so. He's establishing that he's not actually black because he dresses up and plays as one. And this is a tension that I think we see throughout American culture for a long time. The idea that there's a certain affinity between Jews and blacks, and that there's a certain sort of animosity that's built into it. That there are ways in which there's an overlap and there's ways in which there aren't. For a while, this was less of a problem. It's never been easy, but there was a period of time, mostly surrounding World War II, where the idea of sort of Jews and blacks having a symbiosis, having a common understanding of oppression, a common understanding of being put upon, was alive and well. This very much goes around World War II, where the NAACP and African American organizations very much were in line with Jewish organizations, feeling that exposing Nazi hatred would succeed in exposing the evils of racism everywhere. And you do see sort of a spate of films right after World War II where you see sort of this idea that both the Jew and the African American face a similar kind of problem, right? There's this film, Gentleman's Agreement, starring Gregory Peck. Who's seen Gentleman's Agreement? It's kind of a rough watch these days. It's from 1947, and it's about Gregory Peck playing a Gentile who goes undercover as a Jew. And it exposes sort of the civil rights problems of Jews at the time. It's very reminiscent of the book or the film Black Like Me. That's why I put those up there to compare. And the idea is that there is this commonality in American experience between Jews and blacks. This does not last for too long. This is something that was very much in currency right after World War II and tends to go away fairly quickly. There are a variety of reasons for this. Part of this has to do with economic success, particularly in urban spaces among Jews. There are eventually sort of connections that have to do with Israel that play into this idea. But eventually you get a sort of strong understanding that the interests of the black and Jewish communities are very different. And as part of this, that sort of idea of there being a connection goes away really pretty strongly in popular culture. That also has to do a little bit with what came to be sort of the understanding of the American Jew. In popular culture, we have a very limited understanding of what an American Jew is. The discursive construct tends to be a white, secular, fairly, more or less fair-skinned individual. Right? So you get people who are sort of marked. We see Woody Allen's nose and glasses. We see Barbra Streisand's nose. You can sort of, they're marked as Jew in one way or another, but it's sort of a very limited understanding of what a Jew is. Generally Ashkenazi, very rarely religious, right? This is the kind of person that we see in American popular culture, a very sort of white person, a very assimilated person. So if you look at American popular culture, you see very little of non-white Jews, right? Very few people from Middle Eastern origin, very few people who do not have sort of Caucasian skin. And you see very, very little of people whose lives are significantly different culturally in terms of religious observance. That's not sort of what the discursive construction of the Jew is. Right, and this works to sort of further separate the idea of a Jew being a unique kind of cultural group, right? It becomes a branch of whiteness in a lot of people's eyes, partly because of this construction, because this is sort of what they come to think of when they think of the Jew. I want to point to some programs that more recently have been very willing to sort of confront this idea and one way or another kind of other that Jew, point out cultural specificity, point out in some ways connections to African Americans. South Park is my favorite example of this. South Park features a character by the name of Eric Cartman who is sort of virulently anti-everything. Right, he's sort of a ramped-up Archie Bunker kind of character. You're supposed to find his bigotry funny, for one way or another, right? Probably because you're laughing at it, but who knows why you're laughing exactly, right? And Cartman has sort of a special place in his heart for Jews, right? A sort of willingness to out Jews, to put Jews into a group of others. And the show does itself in a way that I think we see sort of a return to the sense of a Jewish otherness that eventually we can attach to this idea of racial difference. And they do it in a lot of very different ways, sometimes very sort of interestingly and complexly, and sometimes much less so. This is a still from an episode called Jubilee. Jubilee, the Jewish characters in the show, Kyle and his brother, go to a place called Camp Moses, where they go and they learn to worship Moses. It's a very strange, it's got nothing to do with Judaism. But you see this sort of very tribal portrayal of Jews, right? Somehow this sort of fits into the mode of the show. In a later episode, we actually see what I found to be one of the more interesting sort of looks at Judaism on television, this sort of very kind of excellently titled episode called Jupacabra, which on the one hand focuses on Kyle being very strange because he's Jewish, he celebrates Passover, and it's sort of this very weird tribal thing to it. But embedded into it also are actually some really interesting Jewish theological questions. You'd be surprised, it's actually fairly interesting. But what I want to point to here is the idea that this show works to sort of put Jews on the level of African Americans in a certain way, of being an out-group that can be kind of looked at as an out-group, and that we can get this sort of Archie Bunker-style comedy out of doing so again. And I want to show two examples. One, quickly, the way that South Park deals with African Americans in terms of its satire, and one sort of kind of confronts you with the way that it approaches Jews. So in this episode, what happens is the town of South Park is overrun by rich people. It just happens that all these rich people are black. So what they do is they chase the people out of town.
They were so scared, I'm sure they'll never be back. That's great. And now we can sell all their homes and become millionaires. What? But then you had to do all that for nothing. Don't you see? If you get rich selling these homes, then there will still be rich people in South Park.
Yeah, you become what you hate. Well, yeah, but at least I got rid of all those damn nicks.
This is kind of a shocking thing, right? Hold on, let me go back. But you sort of see this sort of engagement of, we've got the town full of white people, right? And we have this other group. And they have to be kind of sly about it, right? They have to be coy. It cuts out before the super offensive word comes in. But what I want to sort of make an argument here is that it treats Jews in a surprisingly similar way, except it goes at it more directly. These are just clips of a sort of a flashback in which we hear Cartman describe his Jewish friend.
Jewish. Kyle, when have I ever ripped on you for being a Jew? Oh yeah, well you're a stupid Jew. You're a Jew. Shut your goddamn Jew mouth. Good job, Jew. Jew. Shut not Jew. You're Jewish. You need Jewish. Jew. 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 I told you Jewish people don't have rhythm.
It's sort of very aggressive attitude towards Jews, right? But we have one in which sort of we have a plane of sort of in-group and out-group, right? And Cartman is sort of the core of the in-group, even if you don't like him, right? And he very clearly marks the people around him. And this show takes an extreme effort to make sure Jews are on that out-group, right? If you look at Kyle, the Jewish character, looks exactly the same, but it makes a strong effort to kind of push it towards the outside, right? To make sure the Jews are not fully inside of this whiteness, partially so that it has one group, right, where it can make these sort of jokes really aggressively. That it doesn't have to duck out like it did in the episode about African Americans, right? Where it can sort of not hold its punches, right? And I think it's doing so for the purpose of sort of having that space, right? My favorite example of this, though, is Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with The Daily Show, right? Jon Stewart's a really interesting character because he is, for many sort of young Americans, kind of the voice of liberalism. He's the voice of sort of anti-prejudice, sort of clear, conscious American citizenship. And as such, what his show deals with, in large part, are issues of things like racial injustice and racial intolerance, which it makes some sense, right? But there could be a problem here, because if we look at Jon Stewart, he kind of looks like the man, right? He's like a fairly good-looking white guy in his like late 40s, early 50s, right? And there's some sense in which you might say he sort of represents those implicated in racial injustice. He's been the beneficiary of sort of the system that he's critiquing, which could be a problem, which could be a way in which some viewers are taken to not be sure if they could trust him necessarily, right? Can he accurately sort of represent this liberal viewpoint, having not gone through any of this injustice? And you see, I think, a very strong effort throughout the program to other Stewart ethnically, and particularly to associate him and to put him on sort of a parallel place with African Americans. So I want to give you a quick clip of that.
So not only was today Barack Obama's inauguration, it was also Martin Luther King Day. For his thoughts on this historic occasion, we're joined by senior black correspondent Morgan Freeman. Morgan? I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thanks, Jew. Look.
So we have this talk, which is going to be a very sort of, it's going to be sort of a talk about the way that Martin Luther King Day has been appropriated, that it's being used by sort of the dominant classes, and it's going to be angry in a certain way. And it's introduced by sort of saying, here we have this joke about sort of our senior black correspondent. He calls him Morgan Freeman, misidentifies who he is, right? And his response here is to say, thanks, Jew. Right? This is like the always go-to joke on The Daily Show, if you see it, right? Whenever it gets into this kind of conversation, you're always, well, mark Jon Stewart as Jewish. It happens over and over again, right? On the one hand, it separates him from the senior black correspondent, right? One is black and one isn't. But on the other, it brings them together, right? It shows that they are both people who you can take down with a single word. Kind of reestablishes the Jew in that position. And in doing so, I think you see sort of an affinity between the black and the Jew. And this is something that we'll see throughout the program. I'll give you another example or two.
I've got some very exciting news to report, a breaking story out of the Vatican.
Strong words out of Vatican City today as excerpts from a forthcoming book by Pope Benedict made clear that Jews should not be blamed for Jesus' death.
Yes! Booyah! Not guilty! The Jews are not guilty! Yes! All the verdict is in! Look at that! People, some people stunned, other people celebrating. The black people, I don't know why they'd be celebrating this. It's as though there's no connection between the verdict and the footage we use. So much for the passion for the Christ. Killers not being Jews.
So here, people recognize what that footage was that they were actually showing? It's the O.J. Simpson verdict, right? So Stewart tells you that this footage has nothing to do with what they're talking about, right? But he kind of protests too much a little bit, right? You start seeing sort of the connections here between blacks and Jews by making this sort of overlap, right? This comedic juxtaposition. In this case, we have in both cases, groups of people who are often believe they are blamed for killing people that they haven't, or doing crimes that they haven't, being convicted for crimes they haven't committed. Here we might have a case where they're actually both guilty, depending on how you look at things, right? But you get the sort of the idea of the blacks and the Jews being on the same team here, right? Both people who have been blamed for the wrong things. All right, we're not going to cut to Jews being excited for this. We're going to make the joke and show how it's so similar to being African American. And lastly, I want to take, for this example, very quickly, I don't know if anybody saw this story, Dov Hicken, the congressman from New York, who was caught in blackface, actually, relating directly to what we were discussing, at a Purim party. And so the joke here is going to be sort of, you know, what does our African American correspondent think about this?
Jessica Williams, who is on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, New York right now. Jessica, thanks for doing this. Jessica, what is your take on the situation?
It's an outrage.
Oh.
John, this is just one more example of the politically correct left war on force.
Wait, I'm sorry, did you say there's a war on Purim?
Oh, hell yeah, there is. And John, this is a low-down dirty Shonda.
Shonda? Wait, how is this a shame for Purim?
The way this man hyphen denigrates Purim. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but at what point in the book of Esther do the Harlem Globetrotters show up?
Well, you're right, you know, my name is just the character in the full story. Esther, you work out your name.
John, you can't even say hot form semi-yachts anymore. Now it's just, hey, nice Superman costume. What's next? A Simchat Torah? They just read the clip notes and you're done? Hell no, not on my watch, Stuart. Not in my house.
That's just sad. Somewhere there's a rabbinical college laughing their asses off at this. Meanwhile, we have an audience of Lutherans going.
And again, here we see sort of this extensive effort to, I think, conflate or at least compare Jewish experience, the black experience, the sort of being very different and other and outside, the people that the Lutherans don't get. Right? There's some sort of symbiosis here that's taking place. That Stuart and her have something that sort of link up in a way that the Lutheran audience, the white audience in there, does not get. This is something that we would not see commonly in previous eras of American popular culture, virtually non-existent. And we see it here kind of coming up over and over again. Lastly, I want to go to what I think is the most sort of abstract, but hopefully still interesting idea here. And this is an idea that's sort of rooted in a lot of Jewish philosophy or philosophy of Judaism, in addition to popular culture, right? This sort of difficult, but I think very current still idea of a Jew having the ability to sort of be universal in his or her specificity. This is a quote from Daniel Pearl's father, actually, that I came across. It really struck me. Moment is a magazine of the conservative Jewish movement. Has being a secular Jew made life harder for you? Judaic Pearl says, no, on the contrary, only a secular Jew can be equally respectful of all religions. It's a very strange thing to say. I'm not saying that it's something I agree with, but it's something that I think we see actually popping up in culture more often than you might think. In some ways, I like to bring this idea back to the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who was a Jewish French philosopher who, not until later in life, sort of embraced his Judaism. And he was no theist. He wasn't sort of talking in religious terms, but he liked to talk in paradoxes. He liked to talk about the ways that we construct our world that sort of make the truth of the matter, in fact, impossible. And so he would talk about things like it's impossible to be hospitable, because in order to be hospitable, you have to turn your house over, and once you've turned your house over, you're not in charge of the house to be hospitable. This kind of sort of thinking. And he did this with Judaism. And what he liked to say is that the Jew is very specific in sort of traditional Jewish practice and way of looking at the world. The Jew does things that only the Jew needs to do in Jewish religion. So there are these things that are commandments that Jews do, and Jews do not believe that non-Jews need to do them. But when the Jew does it, they are doing it, at least theoretically, for the good of humanity, for everybody. That somehow the act of being specific is also universal when done by the Jew. Right? And this is an idea that you'd say, how could this pop up popularly? But But I think it does. I think we commonly see characters, more recently than before, where the character is specifically Jewish in one way or another, and his Jewishness or her Jewishness allows her to speak for everybody else, allows her to sort of see through the problems, kind of like Judea Pearl was saying. The secular Jew is able to respect all religions. There is a popular writer by the name of Douglas Rushkoff who sort of makes this one of his kind of main points. He wants to argue that we need to enter a post-religious world, a world in which we are sort of radically egalitarian, and that his case here is that the Jew is uniquely good at this. That Judaism is somehow about sort of questioning, it's about sort of taking down dogmas and rebuilding them, and that the Jew is actually the perfect person to bring us into a sort of universal atheistic world. And he actually has a whole comic book series about this called Testament, where he looks at stories from the Bible and shows how they can actually become arguments for a sort of kind of Unitarian atheism, a way in which what's built into Jewish sort of questioning practices is a universality. But I also think we see this on television. This was a short-lived but a favorite example of mine. Anybody watch the show Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip? It's an Aaron Sorkin show that lasted for a while. And it had this character of Matt Albee, who is a secular Jew. He's an atheist Jew. His girlfriend is this evangelical Christian. And sort of the rest of the characters on the show are kind of these sort of middling, not quite Christian, not quite secular types. And Albee consistently throughout the program is able to sort of see past the issues of these religious problems. And most famously happens in this episode that's about Christmas. And I think we see this, Jon Stewart does this all the time. The Jew, especially the Jew who's not terribly religious, is able to see the true meaning of Christmas, the universal appeal to it. So you have an episode of this series where what happens is there's a debate whether or not the comedy show that he's producing should engage with questions about Christmas. Should they make jokes about Christmas? Should that be part of it? And in the series, there's sort of an older Jewish character who never wanted to deal with that. He was too specific in his Judaism. There is a specific sort of devout Christian character, and she doesn't want to get into it either because it won't get to the real true meaning of the story. Then you have these sort of secular Christians who are concerned with it. They know that the stories that they were told, they don't believe them to be true historically and so on. But the Jew, the secular atheist Jew, loves Christmas because he sees the truly sort of universal aspects of it. And it's almost sort of like a magical thing. Jon Stewart, again, does this all the time, where he sort of understands the true Christmas spirit in a way that other people can't. There's this positionality of the Jew sort of growing up. It's sort of put as sort of this outsider who can sort of see above, see for the rest. And a more contemporary example of that, and I think one that's rather powerful, is Saul Berenson from Homeland. Who watches Homeland? We must have some Homeland watchers. A few. So Saul is the character's Jewish character. He's very, the series' Jewish character. It's a series about terrorism. It's a series about religious extremism. It's a series about questioning sort of how we can do good. And Saul is consistently sort of the voice of reason, the person who can see beyond these specificities. And this comes out very strongly in one episode in which he needs to sort of convince a converted Muslim extremist that what she's doing isn't right, that she shouldn't be sort of devout just to her sect, just to her sort of religious group, but she needs to see beyond. And so what does he do? He takes her out to this sort of like abandoned old synagogue or some old religious space out in Indiana. And he talks about growing up as the only Jew in town. He talks about that giving him the sort of perspective to understand that, all that really matters is sort of being one with humanity, being one with everybody else. Right? And it very much is the Jewishness of him that allows this to take place. Right? He's the person that can kind of talk to the extremist and explain that, no, you should sort of think broader, right? You should think outside of it. And why is it the Jew? It's not sort of clear, right? I mean, there's these ideas that go to Jewish universality and so on. It just seems to be a common character to go to these days, particularly to deal with these questions of Islam. That's why I used that example at the beginning. Sort of a people that is able to kind of maintain an identity of a religion, but not be sort of extremist as the characters in Homeland are portrayed as. Saul also... I think twice he does this throughout the show. A non-Jewish character dies, and then Saul breaks into a Jewish mourning prayer. and he does it for a non-Jew, which would not be appropriate religiously. He does it by himself, which is not appropriate religiously. But the idea is that as a Jew, he sort of has this vantage point, this idea that he can represent others. Now, in conclusion, I want to be clear here that this guy with his hat on backwards, he's not thinking through ideas like that. That's not at all the claim that I'm trying to make here. What I'm trying to say is that there sort of is, in the way that we talk about Jews in contemporary culture, this very sort of slippery signifier. This way in way in which the Jew is now sort of, because we're more open about talking about Jews in Judaism, that there's a certain maybe safety to it. But it allows Jews to come on and take these sort of very pregnant, these very, very sort of meaningful roles that kind of play in between groups, that allow them to represent other groups, right? And I think this is part of what's bouncing around in Seth MacFarlane's head when he says, well, Jews sort of have a perspective that if they're making these jokes, it must be okay. Right? That's sort of his understanding of what a Jew is, I'm arguing, to a certain extent. Do I think this is a good thing? Not at all. I actually think it's kind of offensive. You know, you do something sort of irresponsible on your show and you say blame the Jews. It's part of what's going on here, right? But there's also another sense in which I think he is sort of ascribing some of these big ideas, at least passively, at least subconsciously, to this idea of what a Jew is, who a Jew is in America, and who a Jew can represent. So thank you very much.
Remember?
Oh, Judd Hirsch's character. Yeah. I don't remember.
While you were speaking, I thought of Independence Day. Remember, you
Yeah.
have the Black Will Smith and what's his name?
That's-
Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum.
Jeff Goldblum and
his father, who's
Judd
very
Hirsch.
Jewish. He
Yeah.
says, "Too bad, not everyone's Jewish."
Right. No one's
So, I mean,
perfect.
you have those aspects, but no one's perfect. Yeah, but
Yeah.
we have time for a few questions about not just about what you saw, but about Jews in cinema, Borat, or anything you want. He's an expert in all about contemporary cinema and television. So if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question about the Jew as marquee.
Yeah.
The episode, I don't remember what the series was, but where you showed the parallel to the Abu Ghraib,
Right.
where the Jew stands in for the Muslim.
No?
Why? Why couldn't you use a Muslim in that sense? Is it too raw?
I think that's right. I think that well, for one, it is too raw. For one, you risk evoking a certain look, it could happen. There's no reason you couldn't do it, right? But the question is, where does the audience mind go? Right? One, too on the nose, I think, is one possibility, right? You're making an entertainment program. You want to make a comment on something, right? You don't want to jam it down someone's throat. So that's part of the story. Another part is, I think, that it's safer. The Jew is thought in American culture to be in a relatively safe position. It's kind of horrible to see the guy kind of hug him and say, go pretend you're hiding from the Germans, right? It kind of hurts to hear, but, I'm not afraid. I'm a Jew and I'm not afraid of being rounded up. If I were a Muslim, would I be afraid of rounded up? No, but I would have very likely at the airport felt something closer to that. And it doesn't seem to want to touch that nerve, right? And again, it also, one of and this goes for everything I talked about today, right? You have to understand that in popular culture, a multiplicity of potential meanings is important. That's how you garner big audiences, right? You garner big audiences by putting out images that some people will take to be, oh, that's a very insightful critique of Abu Ghraib, and others will say, oh, it's a silly thing about how college is dumb and they make you do these dumb exercises, right? The Jew, I think, is more polyvalent. Right? More able to take on multiple meanings, and that is sort of one of the building blocks of American popular culture. We have a very diverse culture. People are going to understand things differently, and I think the Jew plays a very nice role in that particular case of allowing people to say, I want to read it this way or this way. That's a really good question. Thank you. What else?
I'll just ask since anything else. When I saw Borat, I was really offended because it's bad enough what he's doing, but someone who's so noticeably Jewish, and if you know Hebrew, you know one of the scenes.
Right, he's speaking Hebrew. Yeah.
And you hear what he's saying, which no one else in the audience gets. I mean,
Right.
that a Jewish person is engaged in that.
Yeah.
I just feel I don't know, am I wrong to be offended? Everyone's laughing, they don't seem to mind it. But,
Right. Well, you're never wrong to sort of interpret something as you do. That is a question. I mostly try to stick to television here, largely because I'm sort of talking about sort of things that aren't garnering a lot of attention. Yeah. I'm trying to talk about sort of what's in the ether as opposed to what's kind of... when it comes to Borat, certainly we could talk about that in this context. I mean, what is he doing there? One, he's playing off the safe position of the Jew in his main audience zones, right? He's selling to Americans and Europeans, Brits, right? And so, you know, if you see, it's not from the movie, but, you know, Throw the Jew Down the Well, it's a song that you see this sort of thing. If you were watching that in the Ukraine, I think that would be sort of a horrifying thing, or the Hungary, where you have these rising anti-Semitic parties, right? In America, we don't really worry about being thrown down the well. And so he can sort of play off of this, right? In some ways, it's a loud, I would argue, it's a loud pronouncement of safety. It's a loud pronouncement of being beyond sort of worrying about these kinds of things, to yell them out loudly, because you know they won't happen. Now, being an international star, I think that there's real irresponsibility there that you're very right to notice, because there are places in the world where, well, they might not throw the Jew down the well, but they might do something. And he does not seem to be sort of interested in that. And of course, again, there's that polyvalence, right? Some people are going to get it and say, like, oh, it's a satire and anti-Semitism, and other people are going to laugh because, ha, I could throw a Jew down a well. Yes?
One of the excerpts that upset me was in the Hamptons. It was, you know, we just can tell that the other person is Jewish by the name.
Yeah.
That he was upset of the Eruv, which doesn't matter to him if he's not religious, because he can carry it around anyway, because it would bring more of that kind here.
Right.
Just like in Gentleman's Agreement, one of the most upsetting scenes was the Jewish secretary who got the job because she anglicized her name, or she wouldn't have gotten the job, but she said, anyway, we don't want to people to be able to get hired with Jewish names, because it would bring the bad sort of Jew, you know, the more noticeable kind of Jew. It's such a hatred of each other, of our own kind.
It is, but I think one thing that is worth noting here, as opposed to maybe in Gentleman's Agreement even, is that we have sort of here, the sympathetic character is actually, I think, even though they don't show which is maybe a point, they don't show a Jew who needs an Eruv, they don't show a Shomer Shabbos, a sort of a more religious Jew, right? But it's the sympathetic character in it, right? It seems to revel in the idea that the Jews are actually more complex than we thought they were, right? The Jews aren't just Barbra Streisand, Woody Allen, and Neil Diamond, right? And this, you know, it's not as though there have never been observant Jews on American television. They're often like victims in like Law and Order episodes and stuff like that. Like if something takes place in New York, there might be one there. But the idea of a religious Jew as a sympathetic character because they're religious, I think is unique. I mean, I have not seen every moment of American television, but ask my wife, I watch too much. And I haven't seen it, right? And again, I think this is a nice opportunity to, you know, they set it up with this Sharia thing, right? And they want to tell you, like, you know, there's a lot of people in our country who are a little bit different. And the Jew can kind of maybe be a way to understand other people who are different. Yeah?
Does the totality of what you're seeing, albeit piecemeal, distort the role of Jews in society, or does it give it, in some ways, should it give Jews a source of pride that they've achieved a certain amount of influence, or is it sort of, depends how you look at it?
Well, it certainly depends how you look at it. I think the first thing to keep in mind, and this is why I keep using the phrase sort of discursive construction of the Jew. Right? We're talking about the ways in which sort of, there is no reality, there is no the Jew. Any group of people is complicated. For a relatively small group of people, Jews are wildly diverse. And that might be true of all groups if you really zoom in on them, but you know, one that I'm familiar with, the diversity is really tremendous. The distortion is the essentialization. Right? The distortion comes from sort of pigeonholing that picture of the Jew, which again, in America tends to be the sort of secular Ashkenazi Jew. I think on the one hand, we see slightly more diverse portrayals of Jews on television these days. I really do. A little bit. We still generally get Ashkenazi. We see a little bit more with observance. We see some differences. And I think that is something that is sort of a point of pride, to the extent that you know, I don't know who wrote the episode about the prison scene with the kosher, but it's probably a Jew who knew something about kosher. And the fact that he did not sort of hide that, he did not tuck that in, that's a progress that I think is worth noting. You know, I think that there's always this concern of there should being an over-representation of Jews on television, which has never really been the case. And I think now that that's less of a concern. And I think because it's less of a concern, that's a good thing. In terms of a distortion, I'm not sure if there's a reality to distort so much as sort of a limited window that we're getting. And maybe that's something similar. What I do know is that you probably would get the sense that sort of most Jews in America look kind of like Woody Allen if you only got it from television. And that's not true, and that's sort of a shame. But that has to do with TV, that has to do with film, that has to do with stock characters. That has to do with having characters that are easily recognized. And it kind of goes across races and across areas. So I don't know if that answered the question. Get it? Yeah.
I just want to, okay, last question. I do want to thank you, though, for using the word Sharia. At least the kids in my class here, now they know what it is. Yeah. One last question.
Just a little comment, and then, you know.
Please.
That's one of the reasons that I like the movie School Ties so much, and I think a lot of Jews did, because most people think of Jews looking like Woody Allen.
Right.
And here you had a Jacques.
Right.
Good looking. Anybody would say he's good looking. And he says, well, I'm still that good looking Jacques fellow. Now you know I'm Jewish. But what do you think though? Remember in the Oscars as Ted, Seth MacFarlane makes the comment to what's his name again? Mark Wahlberg.
Right.
That he says. To ask Mark Wahlberg, are you Jewish? And Mark Wahlberg says, people think I am, but I'm really not.
Right.
He says, wrong answer. If you want to succeed in Hollywood, you better say you're Jewish and you better say pro-Islam. I was so offended by that, you know?
Well, you know, I mean, for one, I promise you, if you ask Seth MacFarlane, he'll say, one of my Jewish writers pitched me that joke. Right, so it's totally okay, right? We you know, the end is in the beginning, right? Which is a great question. You know, I mean, when it comes to that kind of comedy, right? We always have this issue of irony, do we believe that this is a joke about Jews, or is it a joke about jokes about Jews? Is it a meta joke? Is it a joke to make fun of anti-Semitism? I personally have and students sort of tend to really like Seth MacFarlane, so I get rather unpopular with this. I tend to not see the irony in Seth MacFarlane. I don't think he works for it. And I actually would say that South Park does, so I would draw a distinction between those two programs. I think that, you know, really, what do I see when I see the kind of stuff we saw from Seth MacFarlane? I see a desperate attempt to court 18 to 24-year-old men who no longer watch television. And in doing so, I mean, that comes out most strongly with sort of what I would say kind of low-grade misogyny. I saw your boobs, this kind of thing. We're sort of just objectifying women. But, you know, this sort of edgy kind of in-group, out-group kind of humor, make fun of the old Jews kind of thing, I think also fits in that box. And so, you know, I think that sort of have a lot to say about this, but in brief, what I'd say is I think that there's a style of comedy that has been associated with kind of an irony and sort of a progressiveness. It goes back to a lot of shows like The Simpsons and South Park and The Daily Show, and MacFarlane's work kind of gets lumped in with it, and I don't think it deserves it. I don't see the irony there. It's a broader argument, but again, what he would say is, one of my Jewish writers said it must be fine. So is that all?
I want to thank Dr. Sienkiewicz for coming from Boston to be with us tonight.
Thank you.
I was a little worried with the snow. Maybe he wouldn't make it here, but he made it. Very good. And from our fellow Jesuit college, Boston College, look forward to having you again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for coming, guys.
And my students, just make sure that page so we know who's here and who's not.